Hi everyone. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about inking and printing a carved linoleum block. So what I want to do first of all, before I get started with the inking and printing process, is to do what I call pre-press. That's basically preparing everything that I need before I get started. And one of the main things that you want to do for pre-press is to prepare your ink. So you want to mix up the color of ink that you're planning on using so that it's ready to go. What I'm going to do is actually just use black straight out of a can. I'm going to show you both oil-based and water-based ink. So I'm using them straight out of the can and straight out of the tube, so I don't actually have to mix up any colors right now. So my inks are ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and just set these aside for now. Of course, you want to have your block that's already cut, or at least mostly cut. You can get it to a point where you're ready to do a proof print before you do your final prints. Something else that you want to have prepared are your papers already cut to size. Here I have a variety of papers. So for linoleum block printing, you really can use a large variety of papers. I'm going to show you how to print using a baron or hand printing with a thin paper. This is the thin Japanese paper. You can also print on just medium weight, regular medium weight printing paper, or even like the really thick printing papers that you might use for some other printing processes as well. For something like this, I would suggest printing it in a printing press because you're going to have a hard time getting a really good transfer using your hand printing processes. But these lightweight papers, and especially the Japanese papers, really great for hand printing. So what I've done is already cut down a stack of these papers to the right size, and I've chosen to cut papers to about an inch margin all the way around. So I've got my papers ready to go. One last thing that you want to create before you start printing is to create a registration guide. Now for that, you're going to need a ruler and a pencil. I'm going to use a Sharpie so that you can see this very clearly in the video, but all you really need is a pencil and a sheet of scrap paper, like a sheet of newsprint. I have a stack of them here, and what I'm going to do is just take one of these sheets and trim it down a little bit smaller. This is a much bigger sheet than I need. All right, so the size of my registration guide needs to be at least the size of the block and the size of the paper, and slightly larger, and I'll show you why. What we want to do is use this guide on the printing press or when we're printing to make sure that the block lands on your printing paper square in the center, or exactly where you want it to be on the paper each time. So this is going to be the guide that you use for each print. And what I'm going to do is just trace the block on my sheet of newsprint, and because I know my printing paper is an inch wider all the way around, I'm going to use a ruler to measure out 1 inch all the way around. All right, so now what you'll see is a place where you're going to put your printing block. And it should fit pretty well right there. And then where you're always going to put your printing paper. And that way it's always going to print nice and centered. All right, now I have my registration guide. I'm going to go ahead and set it aside and go ahead and ink up my block. Once you're finished with your pre-press activities, you are ready to ink up your block and make some prints. I'm going to demonstrate to you both printing with oil-based ink, and my oil-based ink is from a can, as well as printing from water-based ink from a tube. These both work equally as well for linoleum block printing. What I have is some oil-based ink already put out on a glass plate. Now I do want to talk a little bit about this inking surface. This is a piece of plain glass with a piece of white paper underneath taped down around the sides. If you have a piece of glass to lay out your ink, that's great. If you don't, you could do the same thing with a sheet of clear plexiglass. Another option would be to get like a piece of ceramic tile. You can get these or the plexiglass at any home improvement store. The tile is really nice because if you get a nice white tile, it's already has a white surface and it's really easy to work on and really easy to clean as well. Another option would be to use something like a clear mylar, like this is a Duralar brand. So it's just basically a clear plastic sheet. And what I would do is just take a clean piece of white paper, put it underneath, and tape the corners down to your table. And then that works really well as a good inking surface as well. Now what I've done is put out a little bit of this oil-based black ink on my glass inking surface. And what I'm going to do first of all is to what's called warming up the ink. I'm going to go ahead and warm it up, and I'm noticing a few little bits of dried ink. I'm going to use a scrap sheet of paper and remove a few of those little bits of dried ink that are in there, because I do want it to be nice and smooth when I spread the ink out onto the printing block. And when you have oil-based ink, it's made up of a few different materials. So you've got inks, the pigments, the binders, and some additives. And what happens is it sits in a jar, it kind of tends to separate out. So warming it up brings it all back together again. So I'm basically just picking it up and pushing it back down and just sort of remixing this ink to get all of those different ingredients to get melded back together again into a nice mixture. Another thing is just to loosen it up a little bit, especially when the ink is sit for a while. It tends to get a little bit stiff, so we're just softening it up and getting it ready for printing. And what I want to do is then take this ink, once it's warmed up, I'm going to spread it out a little bit. I'm trying to clean a lot of this ink off of my palette knife, and then I'm going to push my palette knife up into it, picking up a little roll of ink at the tip. I'm going to lay that roll out next to this pile, and I want it to be about the width of the brayer. I'm going to lay out just a little bit more. This is a lot more ink than I really need right away, so what I'm going to do is put the brayer down on the glass sheet. I'm going to push it up just a little bit and bring it back down. And what I'm doing is just taking a little bit and spreading it out into a nice, even, smooth layer here. And I'm picking up the brayer every now and then so the roller can roll just a little bit and keep it spreading out evenly over the roller as well as on the glass plate. Notice how it's becoming really smooth and kind of velvety. This is a pretty light, thin layer of ink right now. I'm going to go back up into the reservoir up here and pick up just a little bit more. Now I want to keep this reservoir separate from this inking pad here, because this is, as you can see, very thick with ink. You can see kind of its shininess, but what we want to do is create a smooth kind of velvety surface that has just a very thin layer of ink. This is where you're going to pick up the ink, because what we're going to do is then transfer thin layers of ink onto the linoleum block. Not thick globs of ink, but multiple layers of thin ink. I'm going to set this aside and pull out another inking plate and show you how to do this with water-based ink. So I'll use this ceramic plate. And the water-based ink you can just squeeze out of a tube, creating kind of a similar line of ink about the width of the roller. And you're going to do the same thing, just push the roller up into it, but spread it out down below. We want to create the same thin area of ink and not a big thick glop of ink. You'll notice that I picked up a lot from that side over there, and I'm just trying to spread that out a little bit more right now. I'm going to set this aside and bring my plate over so you can see applying ink to the plate. And what I want to do is lay down again a thin layer of ink for the first pass. I'll come back and pick up more ink from this ink area, but not from the reservoir. If I feel like I need to add more ink, but I'm running out of ink here in the in this inking area, what I can do is then go back into that reservoir of ink, pick up a little bit more, and go through that same process of smoothing out a nice even distribution of ink. Notice that I'm putting ink down in a lot of different directions. This creates really good even coverage on the plate itself. Now it's starting to look like I have a pretty good layer of ink on that surface. What I'm going to do is go back over it one more time, and this time I'm just going to try to keep it nice and smooth, and hopefully this is going to work out some of those brayer marks that come from the edges of the brayer. So kind of a back and forth, even, smooth motion. See a little bit right there. I'm going to try to mark that out. All right, my plate is inked and ready to proof print, at least to make a first proof print. Something that I'm noticing, I'm going to move this ink out of the way. Something that I'm noticing, and you might see that on your plate, you're going to find sometimes the back of the plate has a backing of burlap, and sometimes these little edges come kind of fraying out, and what you'll want to do is use a pair of scissors and trim them off. And you can even do that before you start inking, because sometimes they'll catch ink and you'll end up making a little bit of a mess on your print if they catch ink and then transfer it to the printing paper. So let's go ahead and trim those off to keep it nice and clean. All right, let's make a proof print and see how this print looks. Okay, I have a block that's been inked up and ready for its first proof print. I'm going to bring over my registration guide. I'm going to set it down in the center. And for this demonstration, I'm going to hand print using both a baren and a spoon. So what I'm going to do is use a thin Japanese paper for this process. Now the Japanese paper that we have is a mulberry paper that has two surfaces. There's a rough surface and a smooth surface. I generally like to print on the smoother surface, but it really works well on both sides. So it'll be your choice which side you want to print on. You might want to try both and see if there's one that you prefer. But I'm going to set the smooth side down, and by using this guide, I'm going to set it nice and centered on my block. And just give it a little press down with my hands to set it in place. The stickiness of the ink sometimes will help hold the paper in place. Now you can go ahead and use a spoon and start printing or start pressing the paper against that block, but I worry sometimes about the paper kind of pilling up on the back, and it helps to make a smooth impression sometimes to have a piece of wax paper on top. So I'm just going to put a piece of wax paper on top, and now I'm just going to start rubbing the back of the paper down against the block so that the ink transfers from the block up to the paper. Another option is to use something called a Baron, which is a printing tool that is made specifically for this purpose. This one has a little bit of a rough surface and it has a nice wide base, so you can also use this Baron to rub that surface to get the impression. All right, I've put down pressure all over the entire surface, but I'm not exactly sure if I've gotten a good impression. I wanted to point out one nice thing about Japanese paper is that you can see the image kind of come through the back of the paper. So it is a nice way to be able to tell if some parts are a little bit too light. But something else I like to do is just peel back a corner and just take a look and see if there's some parts that I could maybe go over one more time. All right, let's take a look at our first proof print. That is not bad for a first print. I do want to point out that the very first print, because the block is a blank linoleum block, sometimes it takes a little bit of extra ink, and this in a way prepares it for the next print. So there's a little layer of ink here that's going to help hold even more ink. So your second print usually comes out much darker. Proof prints tend to look a little bit light and a little bit splotchy, just like this. And in some cases, you might want to go ahead and make a proof print on a sheet of newsprint to save your nice papers. But this also gives you an idea of maybe some areas that you might go back and do a little bit more cutting before you do your final prints. All right, before you make another print, we're going to have to apply another layer of ink. So I'm going to bring my inking plate back over here, and let's apply another layer of ink. And this time I'm going to show you how to print on a printing press. If you choose to print your linoleum blocks on a printing press, first thing you're going to do is remove the blankets from the printing press. These are for a different process, and we're not going to use these blankets for printing linoleum blocks. So just roll them up and set them aside. Go ahead and tape down your registration guide to the press bed with a few pieces of tape on each corner. If you have a sheet of Mylar to cover it, that's really handy to have, because then if your registration guide gets inky or messed up, you can always just wipe it down with a rag and keep using it over and over again. I have a block that's already inked and ready to print. I'm going to go ahead and set it in place on the registration guide. And for this demonstration, I'm going to use like a lightweight printing paper. This is called multimedia paper in our flat files. I'll set it down along the edge of that guide and then just let the paper drape down on top of the block. Now, to impart a little added pressure, I'm going to add a piece of cardstock. This is a pretty thick backing board that I use for my prints. You can also use a sheet of dense chipboard, which is something that you would find like on the back of your sketchbook or on a drawing pad. You can also use like a scrap piece of mat board as well. But I'm going to set it on top. Make sure that it's at least the size of your plate or a little bit larger. And now what I'm going to do is just push the bed plate underneath the roller. Now the roller of the press is what imparts the pressure. So we have the bed plate going in at a certain level, and the roller can be adjusted up and down to the correct pressure. And as it's rolling through, it's going to impart a thin layer of pressure all the way across. Now for these blocks, you don't need a lot of pressure, but just enough to transfer that ink from the plate up to the paper. Once it catches under the roller, that's when you can start cranking the wheel, and just go ahead and crank it all the way through to the other side. right, now when you're printing, you only have to send it through one time. You don't have to send it through and back again. I'm just doing it because I have this camera set up for this video, but one time should be enough. Let's take a look. Just go ahead and peel back real gently from one corner to see how your print came out. Once you finish making all of your prints, one of the best ways to clean your linoleum block is to use just a scrap sheet of newsprint and send it through the press again, maybe 2 or 3 times, just to get all that excess ink off the surface. Once you've done this a few times and you don't see much of the impression coming off onto scrap paper, then let's take it over to the inking table to finish the cleaning process. To clean up water-based ink, all you need is a spray bottle with some water, some paper towels or some rags, and it helps to have a palette knife and maybe just like a scrap piece of paper nearby. The first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and clean the ink off of our inking plate. And what I like to do is just go ahead and scrape off all that excess ink with a palette knife. Just makes it a lot easier to clean up later. This can be folded up and put in the trash. I just want to point out that inky papers like this can't be put in recycling. It just needs to go in the trash. Then you're just going to give it a little spritz with clean water and wipe it off with a paper towel. Make sure you clean off any ink that's been left behind on the handles, on the brayer, as well as on the palette knife. And then I like to give everything one last final wipe to make sure it's nice and clean. For the linoleum block, I wouldn't spritz water directly onto it, but just use the rag or paper towel, dampen it, and then just wipe it off with a damp rag or towel. For cleaning oil-based ink, I like to use either soy solve or just vegetable oil, plus some sort of a degreaser like what we have in the studio is Simple Green, but really any sort of a degreaser that you might use in your kitchen. Household degreasers will work fine. Window cleaners also work just fine. What you're going to do is, first of all, just like we did with the other plate, let's go ahead and just remove all of that excess ink. I do want to point out that this ink should never go back into the ink can. All of the ink that comes out gets contaminated because it's been used in the shop, and we don't ever want that contaminated ink going back into the ink can that might contaminate all of the ink. So be careful not to pull out too much ink. Always just pull out what you need, and you can always get more if you need to, but let's not be wasteful when we're using the ink. Now notice that when I'm using the palette knife to scoop up the ink, the oil-based ink, it doesn't clean it up quite as well. So what I'm going to use is another tool, and this tool is called a razor scraper. You'll see this in the studio, and it has a sharp edge along that tip, so be careful not to cut yourself with it, but it tends to pick up a lot more ink because of that nice sharp edge. I like to go ahead and use a razor scraper to clean off the palette knife as well. So again, you're going to take this inky sheet of paper, fold it up. I just tear it off the phone book and throw it away, and you've got scrap paper ready to go again. We'll squeeze just a little bit of vegetable oil onto the plate surface and get a cleaning rag. And the vegetable oil will dissolve the ink and make it really easy to wipe up. For the brayer, I'll spread out a little bit more oil, and I'll just run the brayer right through the oil just to give it a good coating. Now, once you finish cleaning up all the oil, it might look like you're finished with the cleaning, but there's still another step. What you want to do now is to remove that layer of oil from all of these surfaces, and that's where the degreaser comes into play. So let's give it a good spritz, and you'll just use a paper towel to clean that grease off of all of these surfaces. You'll use the degreaser for all metal and glass surfaces, but we don't for the brayer. The brayer is done with, the brayer is clean with just the oil. If you have oil-based ink left over on your plate that needs to be cleaned off, what you'll use is just a little bit of that vegetable oil that's on your rag and just wipe off as much as you can, and then use a clean, dry rag to do one final wipe. You don't need to degrease a linoleum block.